So this is part 2, Matthew 24. When will these things be? Kind of our key crux verse for this whole thing, Matthew 24:34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So let me get I wrote my introduction down a little bit, so we do need to just do a brief recap for anyone who wasn't here. So last time we started, we noted in part 1 of our study on Matthew 24. We took a decent amount of time kind of setting up the backdrop here of Matthew 24, really trying to show its narrative and its literary context, meaning where does Matthew 24 sit in Matthew as a gospel, and then where does it sit in the flow of Matthew's gospel? And if anyone remembers last time, Matthew 24 is a part of what larger chunk of Matthew? What chapters does Matthew 24 sit in as a larger narrative story?
21 to 25.
Okay, 21 to 25. So Matthew 20, and this is important, Matthew 24 and its literary backdrop sits in a block of text of Matthew 21 all the way to 25, so that when you get to 26, you're actually entering a new section of Matthew's gospel. So very important. And we said that this is important because what you're getting in Matthew 24, and as it bleeds over into 25, is you're getting a composition by Matthew, as he started in 21, of this kind of climactic, this judgment scene, these curses, these woes, of this motif or this theme that's going through these passages. So there's several things that we talked about last time that were crucial for us before we even began talking about this. So first one, if you guys remember, first one was what? Old Testament background. And we couldn't dive into that too deep because we've done biblical theology studies where we dive into the pretty deep ends of the Old Testament background for some of these themes. But the Old Testament background at least portrayed for us that God was going to come to His temple, and there was going to be a decisive day of judgment and salvation that all happens at once. And if you don't have the Old Testament background, then Matthew's not going to make a whole lot of sense. So that was important. Old Testament background for the first part. Second part was the narrative structure that I argued for last time. When you begin in 21, when you read what Matthew says, all the way back in 21, now when they drew near to Jerusalem, and then all the way to the end of 25 into 26, 26 picks up a different narrative of Jesus when He had finished all these sayings. He told His disciples, and He picks up something else. So you have this narrative structure, and then 3, what I called the setup. And the setup was beginning in Matthew 23, is when Jesus no longer is presenting parables to the people, but rather He is now indicting them because they have not believed what He has said. Right? In every single one, what do the people conclude about the tale of those stories? That they're about them. And that strikes them, but it doesn't do anything as far as their repentance. In fact, Jesus then turns upon them, and He starts doing like what all the Old Testament prophets do when people don't repent. He starts pronouncing woes. So He's pronouncing these covenant curses upon them. So that's important. Those were the 3 things that we talked about. And the biggest thing we get at the end of that, going into Matthew 24, is that Jesus pronounces what kind of judgment is going to come upon that generation. It's very important. He says, your house will be left to you desolate, and it's going to come upon the generation of whom He's speaking to. So that introduction was important for us as we started to get into kind of the flow of Matthew 24 itself. And there's obviously a lot more we could talk about, but I mean, church, it's just in order to go through that as carefully and with a fine-tuned, tooth comb we would want to, it would take us weeks to go through that kind of study. So, as we got into Matthew 24 last time, we dealt with 2 particular difficulties in the text in the first half of the passage. So, if you guys are in Matthew 24, we only made it to verse 15. That's where we stopped, and that's all we dealt with, was all the way up there to 15. So there were 2 things that we dealt with. First, the disciples' question, right, comes to Jesus right after Jesus tells them that the standing temple in their day is going to be thrown down, and that its end was about to arrive in their generation. So the disciples obviously then asked that famous question there, Matthew 24:3. The disciples asked, tell us, when will, and just what Jesus had just told them is going to happen, they said, when will these things, right? They're thinking about what Jesus just said. When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Matthew 24:3. And Jesus' response is in relation to those questions as a whole, right? He's going to answer those questions that the disciples ask as a whole, and those questions are then intricately connected to the previous context that we spent the whole time laying out before. Matthew 21, 22, 23. 24 is the hinge that brings all of it together and is going to be how Jesus begins to answer their question in light of what he's already said. So Jesus does a few things for us, right? The first one is we tried to lay out the framing of the question, but then Jesus begins to go through all of these signs. And one thing that Jesus does for us is he informs us through the disciples that the first signs that arise in that time of the awaited destruction are actually not the signs they ought to be on the lookout for. It's not the sign. Jesus gives them all of these signs that will arise in the time between when he says it and when he actually comes. And the disciples are actually expected to see these kind of signs, but they're given in the negative. Jesus says you're going to see these things happen, you're going to see false Christ, you're going to see famines, wars, rumors of wars, all these different things, but he tells them, don't be deceived, right? He says, don't, and false Christs are going to come, don't go after them. These are not the signs. He calls them these birth pains, right? Things that must accompany the time frame, but actually are not indicative of when Jesus' coming judgment is going to happen. They will simply come before it. They will simply be a reminder of the kind of time that they are in. So, Jesus gives them those signs, but then we deal with the fact that though those things are not the signs, the birth pains are telling us that they're leading up to what? A sign that they should be on the lookout for, right? A sign that they should be on the lookout for. And until that happens, there ought not to be alarmed or distracted by everything else that could potentially be going on. But then the last thing we dealt with in our second one was that verse 14, if you guys want to look at that. We dealt with verse 14 about the gospel of the kingdom being proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And just a quick note on this. So last time I made an argument based upon a word in that context of verse 14, and I overstated my case, so I want to correct this on video so that it's out there for people to watch. Last study I said that the word used there for whole world, the word is oikumene. I said that every instance of that word in the New Testament refers to not the whole world as the entire globe, of what we normally think of as the world, but actually the inhabited world or the inhabited empire of Jesus' time. And while the majority of its uses do indicate that meaning, not all of them do. So I misspoke, I was wrong on that, but I still think my argument holds. The majority of the uses of that word hold to the definition we gave last week, that when Jesus says the gospel is going to go out into the whole world, it actually happened in their day. Literally, not that it goes out to every single person in the entire world, but the occupied world of their day, their world, the Roman Empire, that the gospel did make it out through the Roman Empire. Paul makes it clear in his letters that the gospel does this multiple times. And in the book of Acts, we see that by the time the book ends, the gospel is about to penetrate all the way up to Caesar himself. So I just wanted to make that correction on that point really quick so that there's not any confusion about that. But what verse 14 does do for us is give us the one positive thing amongst the signs. And that positive thing is during the time Jesus is making the pronouncement and his coming and judgment happens, not only will that time be filled with all sorts of madness, like people falling away, false messiahs coming, but one good thing happens during that time. The gospel of the kingdom is proclaimed throughout the whole world during this time between Jesus pronouncing this thing to happen and the thing actually coming to be. But what we're going to focus on today is going to be right there in 15. So if you guys want to start right there with me, we're going to cover the remaining parts of this, and I'm going to kind of fly through these because I have 4, and I want to cover them, and I want to get all of them. So you guys might have some questions about these, and that's fine. You guys can ask the questions when we're done. If we have some time at the end, we can answer a few questions. But my goal really is just like last time, is to give you the best response to these 4 issues so that you have a framework for how you understand this, and maybe not every little detail is answered in this. So, and I will admit there's a few in here that while I feel like I have a good answer on, I don't think are so set in stone that there can't be some kind of debate among some of these, but I'll get there when we get there. So focus on today is going to be the last remaining part of this. So we're going to technically cover all of chapter 24, but with only using 4 points in this. So first one is going to be this, the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24:15. What is that? Second is going to be the sign of the Son of Man after the days of that tribulation, Matthew 24:29-30. The third one, this generation, what does that mean? Matthew 24:35. And then the last one, Matthew 24:36, but that day and hour. So we're going to focus on those 4 because I think those are probably, at least in my estimation, 4 of the harder texts within this section that gets a whole lot of different interpretation as far as what it means. So let's start Matthew 24:15. Here's what Jesus says. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. So a couple things. Jesus is, right, he's still continuing to pick up on the disciples' question, right? So if you're looking at your Bible, forget the heading. Forget the heading and forget your verses. Jesus is continuing this without any kind of pause or stop. And the reason I say this is this verse has often led people to assume a gap in time between the events that came before in verses 4-14 than what begin at verse 15. And so they'll say, so when you see the abomination of desolation, they go, okay, that hasn't been seen yet, so there's going to be this gap of time, right? Signs will happen like false Christs and messiahs and wars and famines and earthquakes. Those things happen, but this one hasn't happened yet. And so often when people see verse 15, they create this gap of time where the rest can be located either in the past, coming into our present day, and 15 gets thrown all the way out into the future as something that we're still anticipating, something we're still looking for. Does that make sense? So I want you to just kind of forget those chapter breaks and those divisional markers in your Bible and just think Jesus is continuing his same thing right here. So in 15 he says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. What Jesus is doing, he's continuing the disciples' questions. What was the first thing that disciples ask? When will these things happen? Right? They want to know when. And what did I just get done concluding? Everything up to 14 were signs that were telling you it's growing, but those aren't it. Right? That's how you would know that these things aren't happening yet because the sign hasn't taken place. These are not the ones you're supposed to look for. But now he's telling you one sign that you ought to pay attention to and look for because that will tell you what? When will these things be? So when this sign comes, what should the disciples say in their minds? These things are here, right? That'd be the conclusion. So Jesus says that. He's picking up on the same question, but now, instead of the negative argument that he did before, the negative, and when I say negative, I don't mean like being a Debbie Downer kind of thing where Jesus is just sad. When I say negative, I mean he's making it a case of things you're not to look for, and now he's making a positive case of the thing you're supposed to look for. So that's what I mean by that. And so he's answering that question, when will these things take place? And now Jesus is giving them the clearest sign they could possibly see in their day that would let them know that those things were about to take place in their lifetime. And this passage, as I've stated, it's just been wildly misunderstood in a number of ways. And it's because, like I said, 15, people try to wrap it up and they try to place the timing of 15, the event of 15, of seeing this abomination of desolation as something distant in the future from when Jesus spoke the words. So Jesus is telling the disciples this, and people go, yeah, that's going to be way down in the future. They haven't seen it yet. None of us have seen it yet. So we're looking for this far future distant abomination of desolation. And that's usually how people think of this passage. And a common way that they see it is this, of interpreting the text, is they see this abomination of desolation in Matthew 24 as some kind of future personal figure. And what he does is he comes in and he exalts himself in God's temple among God's people, and he does so in a temple that's rebuilt in the future. So obviously, I've asked you guys this a million times before, is there a now standing temple in Jerusalem? No, there's not. And my estimation is there never will be, but even if there was, right, I don't think that this has anything to do with that, but people often assume that this is what this text is referring to, because they'll say, how can the abomination of desolation take place when there's no temple? And that's actually a good question, right? Because if there is no temple, it doesn't seem like this prophecy can take place. But that's only the case if, what? You assume it's future. If you assume it's future, then you would be right to look at the text and say, there's no standing temple, therefore this has not happened yet, we're awaiting it in the future. But if we back our argument up, back all the way to 23 to 24, what is the disciples' question in their own day? When's that thing coming down? All right, so you guys picking up with me? You guys tracking so far? So let me give you several reasons why I think this understanding is faulty. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. I'm not going to bring up anybody's name or anything. Just want you to understand why I think that understanding of that passage is wrong. So first point. Our previous context that you guys have now read and seen should help you know that that would be the most untenable, the unlikely interpretation of that text that could ever be offered for that text. And why? Why would that be the case? Why would a future understanding of that text be so demonstrably false based upon us giving a context of where Matthew 24 sits? What's been going on this whole time that would make that impossible? Right, and in whose day?
Like right now, like in Jesus' day.
Right, amongst his own disciples.
Like, literally his own.
That's right. Okay, so we literally spent like 30 minutes last time giving you guys the context from Matthew 21 to 24. Jesus is indicting who? People 2,000 years from now? No, he's indicting Jews in his day. Who does he speak to and says, your house is going to be left to you desolate? Jews 2,000 years down into the future? No, the Jews in his day. So when he's answering the disciples' questions, who is he answering it for so that who could obey it? His disciples. So just on that alone, I could say it's not a good argument. Just based upon that, it does not fit the context at all. It makes the position completely untenable as an interpretation for this text, in my opinion. And Matthew is building up an indictment against people in his own day. And we need to remember the disciples' question is concerned with things that are going to occur as Jesus has told them at the beginning in Matthew 23 and as he's going to tell them at the end in Matthew 24. In this, or he's speaking to your generation, would be another way to say it. He's talking to his generation. So on that alone, I think that position is completely untenable to hold. This is something that was going to happen then. And the disciples, as you think about it too, what's being described in this section is something that, yes, it is future in one sense, but who's it future to? Who had not experienced the things that Jesus has talked about in this section already? The disciples, right? So in one sense, he is telling them to look for something in the future, but in whose future was it? Their future, not ours. So what's being described in that section, though it has not occurred, it was future for the people who were hearing the words from Jesus' own mouth. And for the disciples themselves, they are the ones who are warned to do what when they see the abomination of desolation? 16, flee. Run. So I think that alone, just the context of this, would flat out bar us from holding a future interpretation of that text. Second, I would say, as we'll see as we get into this text, is the Old Testament background does not point to a yet future fulfillment of what Jesus is saying in Matthew 24. And I'll get into those reasons as we dive a little bit deeper into that. But that would be my second point. Jesus is bringing in Old Testament prophetic hope, and he's not doing so to just go, here's the Old Testament prophetic hope, but let's hold off on it for another 2,000 to 3,000 years, even though they've been waiting 700 years for this thing to come to pass. So Jesus is not just, he's not putting a pause button on an Old Testament hope that should have been occurring in his day. And we'll see that too. And third would be this. I think this one becomes the easiest as far as any of you could try to maybe grasp at first if you're first understanding this, and that would just be the Gospels themselves help you try to understand this text right here. And I think it does so to where even someone who's picked up their Bible for the first time could actually understand what is Jesus referring to when he says, when you see the abomination of desolation. And the other Gospels will help us understand that. So I think based upon those three things, holding a future interpretation of that text, I just don't think it's tenable to hold. I think it holds no water. It'll fall flat on its face. It makes no sense of the literary context of the Old Testament background or even the Gospels themselves. It just doesn't make sense of it. So, but let's note a few things in here. What's some things we can say about this text then? And so here's a couple things I want to note about Matthew 24:15. So this one's a little bit simpler than actually getting into what the abomination of desolation means and is. But just notice the use of the pronouns, right? Something as simple as looking at the pronouns of this section and seeing who Jesus is talking to. So I'm not going to read every single verse in this, but just hear the way Jesus is speaking, right? He says, so when you see, who's he talking to? Disciples. He says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, and then go down to 17. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight, right? Whose flight? Your flight may not be in winter or on a what? A Sabbath. Any of you afraid of fleeing in winter on a Sabbath when you see the abomination of desolation? No, there's no Sabbath. No one's observing Sabbath in here. Okay, so, and it just continues on and on and on. 20, pray that your flight may not be on winter or Sabbath. 23, verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, I can just keep going on and on with the whole pronoun train, but I think you guys get it. The pronouns in the local, think about how localized that context is. When you see it, you're able to actually see it and do what when you see it? Flee. Right? There's an actual command that is so localized to the context that you can see the abomination of desolation and you can respond appropriately. You flee. Jesus tells you to get out of town. You're in Jerusalem, time to take a hike, go. You need to get out of there. You can actually obey what Jesus is saying. So I think the pronouns, local context here around this sign in Matthew 24:16 to 28 is demonstrating something about at least how we're understanding this abomination of desolation. At least we can understand one thing about it. If we don't understand everything, this abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel was something or someone that happened in their day. I mean, I just think that's at least one simple conclusion we can come to. This was something that happened in their day. Now, second, and this is where This is where I'm going to present a few options here because I don't really know where I'm settled on this necessarily. Apart from the context and the time frame, I am settled on that. I think this happened something in their day. So this is something that can be debated kind of in-house among people who hold this interpretation of Matthew 24. But I think there's a good reason as you study what that phrase means, the abomination of desolation, it can get very complicated because what you begin to see in the Old Testament is that word abomination gets attached to ritual rites and ceremonies of worship that get polluted by God's people. And so it's used throughout all the Old Testament. So you think of what Nahab and Abihu do, right? When they come and they profane the altar, they come in, it's an abomination is what it means. They come and they abominate God's holy place, and thereby what comes upon them? Desolation, destruction comes upon them. And you see this played out over and over again. Like Manny preached, you see it in 1 Samuel. You see Eli's sons doing abominable things within the worship and the rituals of God's people in the temple. God judges them and creates desolation because of abomination. So the pattern that you get in the Old Testament typically is of God's people actually being the abomination or causing the abomination that brings about a desolation among them. But one interesting thing that Daniel does with that theme is he kind of transforms it a little bit. Because when you get to Daniel and you get to all of Daniel's prophecies, Daniel starts to actually speak of pagan kings. And what they do is they come in and desecrate God's holy place as an abomination. And it's really one of the only places you really see it in the whole Old Testament. It's usually always referred to the people of God doing it, not some outside pagan nation coming, a pagan nation being an abomination amongst God's holy things. But you start to see in Daniel these prophecies of these different kings, especially like you get Artaxerxes, right? He comes in and he abominates the temple, right? And back in, I think it's like 180 BC. He comes in, he brings all these ritual things among God's temple, and he desecrates the temple. So Daniel is kind of portraying both of these realities at the same time, which can make it kind of difficult in trying to really pin down exactly what the abomination of desolation here is in Matthew 24. So this use of it here in this context by Jesus, I think he is understanding that what Daniel saw in his day, and let me ask this question again, was that future in Daniel's day? It was, right? It was so future in Daniel's day. What was Daniel told to do at the end of the prophecy? Was he to keep it out and read it aloud? No, he was to seal it up until the appointed day, right? He was to seal this prophecy up until its time was arrived. And so Daniel is actually seeing something in his future, and I think Jesus is then going, yep, that future Daniel was looking at, it's right here. This is one of the signs that this future prophetic anticipation is happening right now. So there's this, and like I said, this is where it can get kind of dicey on how we understand this abomination of desolation. I do think there might be a stronger case for one position over the others based upon a couple of texts that we'll read. But let me kind of give you how people have typically tried to understand this if they understand Matthew 4 according to the way that we're presenting it here today. So the kind of in-house debate, we've had three options. So what is the abomination of desolation? Well, behind door number 1, you have the Zealots. So these were Jewish Zealots. And does anyone know the disciple who was actually a Zealot? Who? No. That's right. Okay, so you hear Simon, he's called the Zealot, right? So he comes from these sects, these Zealots. These were, I guess a good way to put it would be fanatics, right? These are radicals who are trying to, they are ready to take up the sword against Rome. These are the kind of people that we typically think of with these Zealots. So one option is around the time that Jerusalem gets destroyed and the temple gets destroyed, what you have leading up to it is a number of sieges of this city. And so as Rome begins to come against Jerusalem starting in 66 AD, what it begins to do is cut off entry into the city. But a number of times the Roman army comes and then has to leave, comes and then has to leave until it finally comes in 69. Pretty much starves out the city for about 4.5, 5 months, and then 80, 70, they sack the whole thing, temple comes down. But what you have during this time is when this happens, not only is Rome invading Jerusalem and causing havoc there is civil war going on in Jerusalem. You have all these rival factions coming against one another, and some of the biggest ones were these zealot groups. And these zealot groups they literally were storming the temple, and they were slaughtering all of their enemies, their own kin, right? Their own Jewish blood, slaughtering these people in the outer courts, killing Gentiles, killing their own people inside the inner court, entering into the Holy of Holies where they're not supposed to go. They are not the high priest. They are not to go in there, right? So they're literally causing a desolation of the temple by their abominable deeds of not following God's commands and these things. So that's one option. People have seen that abomination which causes desolation as these zealots come in, they pollute the temple during this time, and they are this abomination which causes desolation of Jerusalem, causes their judgment. So that's one. The second, probably the most popular understanding, is the Roman army. And there's good arguments for this one. One, in Daniel, when you get to Daniel 10, 11, and 12, there is the Daniel 8, 10, and 11 is what I meant to say. Daniel 8, 10, and 11. The abomination language is used of pagan kings who are coming in and toppling over either different nations, or they're coming in and they're wreaking havoc upon God's people in the Old Testament. And so that language gets applied to these nations, and typically as the symbol in the king, as an abomination who comes and brings desolation upon the city. And so a lot of people have attributed that abomination of desolation, which Jesus says in Matthew 24:15, is the Roman army coming in, sieging, and laying the city flat. And so that's second option. Third would be that the Jewish high priests are the abomination which causes desolation. And so this one, it's got some weight to it. I don't really know how I feel about this one. Honestly, I think it's the weakest out of all of them. There's some weight to it. As you think about when Jesus comes, he's presented as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He's the final sacrifice. You think of the book of Hebrews. There has been now one sacrifice made for all time, right? The propitiation for all sin. And so, think about the author of Hebrews making the argument, the reason you don't go back is because you have the substance and the reality now. To go back is actually to go back to something that is now. In light of Jesus coming, it's obsolete. And to go back to it and to trust it would actually put you in not just a neutral category, it would put you in a category of practicing evil, practicing wickedness. And you see who is persecuting the church all throughout the book of Acts. It's not Rome, at least not right up until the end. Who is it? It's the Jews. And often it's people who are high priests and in high positions of power. It's often the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests themselves who are bringing upon God's own people this kind of persecution. And so one argument will be what you see with the high priests and the high people within the Sanhedrin and all these people in the book of Acts is they are actually desecrating God's true temple. And the way they're doing that is they are persecuting the church of the living God in Jesus Christ. And by doing so, God is bringing about desolation upon the city of Jerusalem. So those are your three. I think there are strong arguments to make among all of them. As of now, I think I see a blend of two of them, but I think the one that lends itself probably the most for its strongest argument would be the second one, that it's the Roman army. And the reason for this is being, if you guys flip over to Luke, you guys can keep your place there in Matthew. But in Luke's gospel, and in the synoptic gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? These are three gospels that help give light or give sight. These are all, the same narrative stories told sometimes in more or less detail, different vantage points. And I think it's Luke 21:20 off the top of my head. Luke 21:20. This is Luke's accounting of the Olivet Discourse, which is what we are reading in Matthew 24. And you can see that the language is very similar that is used in Matthew. And so let me just read you part of it so you can hear the similar language. So here's 21:20 part B. Then know that its desolation has come near. 21. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, what does that sound like? Matthew 24, right? That sounds exactly like Matthew 24. Well, what did I just skip over? The first half of that sentence. So go back to Luke 21:20, first part of that sentence. But when you see what? Does Luke say abomination of desolation is standing in the holy place?
No.
He doesn't. Luke is taking a different vantage point, and he sees what? But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near. So Luke gives you kind of an interpretive clue, kind of an interpretive case here, that what he is seeing as part of this desolation that's going to come upon the city, this abomination, is seen in the Roman Empire coming in and sacking the city and the temple. And there's other reasons why maybe that interpretation doesn't hold the fullness of that phrase, abomination of desolation, but we can actually talk about that at the end if anyone has questions. But I do think that out of all three of those, that's probably the strongest interpretation out of all three of those. So, but just know that people take different positions on that one. I don't really think that's much to buck at if someone takes a different position on that than you, if they carry the same context and the same understanding of the larger picture of Matthew 24. So there's that first point right there. So right there, Matthew 24:15, abomination of desolation. So moving on to our second one. After those days, the sign of the Son of Man. So these last three I think are actually going to be pretty quick, because I really just want you to kind of get straight to the heart of all of these. So Matthew 24:29 and 30, here's what it says. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So two particular phrases. There's actually a lot of phrases we could deal with in that section, but two I'm going to particularly focus on. One, notice the transitionary language here is not, in my opinion, is not one of moving from one topic to another. Rather, it's continuing the same topic, but what's going to happen after something is completed. So let me explain this. There's another interpretation that at 29 you have another break, right? So people really try to chop up Matthew 24. So they'll say 15, there's a break, and then here at 29, here comes another break. And if you read the other Gospels, they don't emphasize it like Matthew does, of saying immediately. They'll just say after those days, or the tribulation of those days. And so they'll say, well, those days that come after this tribulation are actually speaking of the days we live in. Either days that started when this all in Jesus' own day and now extends into ours, or if the abomination which makes desolate is yet future, then this is something still yet further in the future that happens after that thing happens. So you can see it can start to get really convoluted, I think. It starts getting really complicated. But I don't think we need to take that when Jesus says immediately after the tribulation of those days as he's taking some change in subject here. Rather, I think he's just focusing the attention off of the first part of the disciples' question is, when will these things be? And then what do the disciples ask? What will be the sign of your coming? Right? That's important. So I think in 29, it's important that Matthew here qualifies that by saying immediately after those days. Is there any gap in time? Right? Would you be able to allow any gap in time? I don't think so. You look through all throughout Matthew's gospel when he uses the same word immediately, and he doesn't use it very often. Or if you go to Mark's gospel, Mark uses it all the time about Jesus immediately went over here and did this, immediately went over here and did that. There is not room in that phrase for a gap of time. Right? There's just not. So whatever comes in 29 comes right on the heels of what just got done in 28. And I think it's this. When you see the sign of this abomination of desolation, he tells them that you're supposed to know that the end is near. But let me ask you this. Has the end come? with the abomination of desolation? No. Right? It couldn't have. And if some of you answered the other reason, let me tell you why. It's telling you that the end is right in front of them, but it can't be that the end has come in its fullness, because then they couldn't obey the command to flee. Right? If the thing that tells you the whole thing has now been done away with in one thing, and it's when Rome begins to surround the city, then they can't obey the command for them to be able to flee and avoid what is going to come. And I think that's going to be the total sacking, not only of the city, but of the actual temple itself. So I think in 29, when he says immediately after the tribulation of those days, I think the days being spoken of are the days of tribulation in 15 to 28, right before the sign happens of the coming of the Son of Man. Is everyone tracking with me on that one? So in this transition here in 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the days that Jesus is referring to is the tribulation that is going to come from everything previous, all of these birth pains, and even this sign of this abomination of desolation that's been spoken of by the prophet Daniel. After all these things occur is when now the appearance of the sign of the Son of Man will be given. So that's the first part of it, after those days. And then second part, the sign of the Son of Man. Really just want to turn your guys' attention, I think, to one particular place where I think Jesus is drawing this from in majority, and that would be Daniel chapter 7. So you don't have to flip there, you can.
Real quick, while you're going there, so what you're saying is in 29, immediately after tribulation, he's sort of jumping back and saying all of the stuff leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and then the actual destruction
Right,
is going
right.
to be what is immediately following the tribulation.
Correct. Right. There's this tribulation period. Yes, correct. So those days would be referring to what he's already said they're going to experience. And when those days are finished, then the end's going to come. And the end, is going to come because there will be the sign of the Son of Man. And that'll be the marker that the end has come. So I don't think the abomination of desolation is the sign that the end has come, but rather is the one sign that they are to look to know it's almost here and we better get out of town. All right, does that make sense? So that's how I'm seeing that. So let's pick up the sign of the Son of Man. Daniel chapter 7. I think Jesus is drawing from this vision here in Daniel 7 to understand what this sign is going to be. And I'll have to give a little bit of explanation for this because it might not make a whole lot of sense, but I think it will after some explanation. So Daniel 7:13 is where I'm going to begin. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Amen. So I think Jesus is particularly drawing off of this imagery right here when he says the sign of the Son of Man. Now, here's where we have to offer a little bit, and this takes a little bit of theological interpretation here, because Jesus actually never really explains the sign to you. He assumes you'll be able to know it, right? All he says is, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. That's all he says. He doesn't say what the sign of the Son of Man is appearing in heaven. And I think he's drawing on something in a holistic way. Let me explain it this way. When did Jesus ascend to the right hand of the Father? This is pretty easy. We preached a whole Sunday on it. That's right, Nick. And Nick preached a sermon on that. I'm glad he was paying attention. Okay, so no, but think about this, because we got to think here, because if we don't, I think we can get a little bit confused and try to come up with some weird interpretation of this. But we just need to think. We need to think biblically and not think so much like we do. We think like a newspaper. Like we just got to see one thing and that's it. Jesus ascends to his Father at the ascension, right? So does Jesus have to wait 40 years until he destroys Jerusalem to sit down at his Father's right hand? No, he's already sitting there, right? Book of Acts, first martyr in the church. What does he see? He sees Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father, right? So he's there. He's ascended. He's been enthroned upon high upon this seat. So I think what we have in Daniel 7 is the ascension of Jesus Christ to his Father's right hand. And as Philippians 2 does it, it's his exaltation. And that means it's his glorification, not only of his body as he receives a resurrection body and he's glorified, but he's also glorified in his office, that he is the one who has fulfilled what Adam was supposed to do, right? And now he's being exalted and sitting on a throne. And because he sat down on a throne, he's been given something. He's been given a kingdom, and now that kingdom's going to grow because he's been exalted to that position. So what I think Jesus is ultimately referencing here is back in Daniel, that the sign that appears in heaven is not something that you literally see with your eyes, as if the heavens split open and they see Jesus standing there, sitting on a throne. Rather, I think he's referring to that sign there in Daniel 7 about Jesus sitting at the right hand of the Father, coming up to the Ancient of Days after he ascends in glory on high to the Father. Is everyone tracking with me so far on how I'm at least understanding that language? So I think that is what is being referred to. But then notice here in 30 the way that it's phrased right here. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So we typically see that and read that of, okay, they're actually going to see Jesus coming down, riding some clouds, like on a wave coming down out of heaven, and they're actually going to see him and they're going to mourn because of that. But we need to think back to the Old Testament context of what Jesus is referring to. Where is the Son of Man going in Daniel chapter 7? He's coming on the clouds going where? He's going up. He's ascending into heaven. And there there came one like a Son of Man. He came to the Ancient of Days with the clouds of heaven. But he rode up to the Ancient of Days. So I think what's happening here is you're having this prophetic language being used to draw an image of what is drawn all throughout the Old Testament of what God does when he comes and he judges. When God comes and he judges nations in the Old Testament, it's spoken of him riding upon a cloud as he's coming in judgment. But obviously, God never ascended down on a cloud and judged Edom, or he never ascended down on a cloud and judged Egypt. He never came down and ascended upon a cloud and judged Assyria. Right? Those things didn't happen that way, but it's spoken of in this prophetic hyperbole of speaking in this very exaggerated language of the kind of judgment that's going to happen, something that they should perceive. And I think Jesus is doing the same thing here, is that when they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, and they will perceive him to be doing so, is when, I think, the judgment of Israel comes, when the city is sacked and the temple is destroyed. So I think what happens with that sign is everything gets thrown into this coming of the Son of Man. As he ascends on high and takes his seat at the throne and he's given a kingdom, there is this time frame in which his kingdom is being established, and there is one that's about to be dethroned. And you have this culminating effect of this sign happening as Jerusalem is destroyed. So I would think of it like this. The ascension of Jesus is the beginning of this holistic sign, and the end of it, the vindication of Jesus Christ, that he is who he says he is, that he is the ascended Son of Man, is that he came and he judged the very people he said he was going to come and judge. Does that make sense? I know it can be kind of confusing, because we think of the coming of the Son of Man, he ascends on high to the Father, as, well, he ascended there. That's the completion of that sign. That's all that it can be. And I think there's more wrapped up into what it means. I do think it means Jesus ascending to heaven when he's raised from the dead, ascends to the Father. I think that is Jesus going up to the Ancient of Days. That is him coming on the clouds of heaven. But also part of it gets wrapped up in also the judgment that he brings upon Jerusalem, and that he is vindicated as the one who is sat down at the right hand of the Father. So you guys can ask questions about that, or we can talk about that after. That's just how I think that is being understood there. So, well, a couple things then here really quick. One, I think Jesus is continuing the same theme as he has been continuing, and this will be the culminating end in this section right here on what this is going to be like. So when he starts saying immediately after the tribulation, he's telling them right after the tribulation happens, there's going to be this sign that you know the end has come. And it's going to be the sign of the Son of Man. And I think what he's saying is the vindication of the Son of Man. They will see him, and they will see him in this. The way they will perceive or see him is that they're judged. I think that's what he's saying. And I think he's pulling largely from Daniel 7, 13 and 14 upon that point. So I don't think what you have in 29 to 32 is the second coming of Jesus Christ at this point. I don't think that's what it's talking about here. And I'll get to that in a little bit too. So third point, because I don't have too much time and I want to hold true to my word. Third point, this generation, Matthew 24, 34. This one I think is going to be rather easy because I've already covered in depth, I think, the pronoun argument of who Jesus is talking to. So what's interesting is after 31, you don't really get any more discourse about the actual events that are going to take place in the near future. 32, you get kind of like a short analogy that Jesus draws up of how they are going to know and perceive when the time comes. And so he talks about the fig tree, and you learn a lesson from the fig tree, right? Very basic lesson that they all should know, right? As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts out leaves, you know the summer is near, right? And I think what he's saying is the fig tree is corresponding to all of the signs that came before. As a fig tree starts to blossom and bloom, you realize, summer's near, right? I see leaves. For them, they're going, man, all these things have been happening, all these birth pains. The sign, or the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, we know it's near. So I think he's just drawing a pictorial analogy there. And then look at 33. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. And I think this nearness is Jesus' coming in judgment. That's the nearness. And then 34 is the text that we have. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So if you guys look back in Matthew 23, and you go back to 29, where we started kind of that setup for Matthew 24, he's pronouncing the woes against them, right? And he says, if we had lived in the day of our fathers, we have not taken part with them in shedding blood. And then he tells them thus, you witness against yourself, 31, that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify. Some of you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. 36. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So as Jesus builds up 24, he actually also creates bookends for you, meaning he creates a beginning and an end for you to understand how this prophetic judgment is going to come about. He begins by saying it's going to come about upon which generation? His, the one he's speaking to. And then he ends with the same phrase, 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, right? So the question would be, as some interpreters have done, is they see this generation right here. Some have interpreted it as this: truly I say to you, the one or the generation will not pass away who sees these signs. Something like that. That's how they're seeing that. The generation being spoken of is actually the one who sees the signs. And they'll say, well, that generation didn't see the signs, so it must be a future generation, which right from the get-go, the context alone would make that an untenable interpretation of this text. Another would be, truly, truly, I say to you, this race or this generation, meaning this kind of people, the Jewish people, will not pass away until all these things take place. So instead of meaning the generation present before him, meaning the people standing before him, that's what we mean by generation. If I get before people and say, man, my generation, we're a generation of whatever, such and such, I'm talking about people associated with my time frame, right? Not my race. I don't go my generation and go my German people. I don't even know who they are, right? I've never met them. I'm talking about people contemporary to me. And so same thing here. There's been a number of translations offered, there's been a number of interpretations offered for that have just tried to dice that thing up and make it absolutely illogical, in my opinion, trying to understand what this is going to happen. It could not be simpler, folks. He tells those brood of vipers, it's going to happen upon your generation. And then in 24, he ends with the same phrase. When are all the things talked about in Matthew 24 going to occur? That generation. I mean, I really don't have much else to offer. You go and do your own study about the word there, generation, within Matthew, and you're going to find that every time, well, let me rephrase that. Let's say most of the time. 99% of the time, because if there's one and I'm wrong, I don't want to correct again next time. But I actually think this one is every time in Matthew. It is used as speaking about a contemporary generation of Jesus' own people. All right, just that one gets spent a lot of time on, but man, that is just, there's nothing else to add to that. It's just that simple, right? It's that generation. It's the people whom live during Jesus' lifetime. It will happen during their generation. So there's our fourth point. And yes, sweet, 3 minutes, because this one's going to be a doozy as well, and then we're going to end. Okay, so last one here, and this one gets to 36. So unlike the previous ones in Matthew 24, I want to make a couple of caveats here. There are people, and a lot of people, who don't take the position that I think I take, or Nick takes, or Manny takes on this position on Matthew 24:36. So I want to throw that out front. This is not something you walk into other churches and just start talking about. Like, have some wisdom in this. Don't go into a church and go, so what do you think about the transition in 24:36? Terrible idea. Don't do that. Like, don't introduce yourself as that guy. And for good reason. There is a long-standing interpretive history to 24:36 that what you're getting in Matthew 24:36 is a change in subject, right? That what you get is Jesus is now going to change subjects here about a soon coming destruction, and now he's going to begin talking about what is typically referred to as the second coming. And let me state this with absolute clarity so there's no confusion. We believe in a physical, bodily second coming of Jesus Christ. I have preached what I consider a glorious sermon on the resurrection, and not because it was fancy, it's because I saw what God had to say in that text and I preached it. And I believe in the resurrection with my whole heart. And you have pastors in here who have shed tears over people who have denied this. So please hear that. We believe that. Anyone that tells you otherwise, they are a liar and they are speaking falsely against you in the church. And you can show them this video to correct them. There is a lot of emotion and a lot of baggage packed away in this text right here in 24:36 that if you don't take the traditional interpretation that it's speaking of the second coming, people often will accuse you of going off into like heresy or something. And I don't think that needs to be the case at all. So I want to clarify that, because when we hit 24:36, here's what it says. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels, or the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. And the reason people have often taken this as a passage concerning the second coming goes all the way back to 24:3, when the disciples ask their question after Jesus tells them all these things are coming down. What do the disciples ask? When will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming? And then this is where they get it from, and the end of the age. And they assume that the disciples' question actually has two different topics in mind. Jesus is coming in judgment, and the end of the world where Jesus comes back a second time. That's how it's usually thought of, right? But I think we tried to show the disciples' questions come as a package whole. It's not getting chopped up. I don't think it's getting chopped up. And I think the way that they ask it is indicative that the fact that they see all of these connected. When these things happen, when the sign of the Son of Man comes, means the closing of an age, whatever that may be. And we said we think that is the end of the Old Covenant age. But a lot of people have taken that to mean end of the world when Jesus comes back in His second coming. We believe in the second coming. When it comes to this transition right here in this text, I don't think it is the best understanding of this text. I think you can hold to it. I think there's decent arguments for it. I'm not going to make the arguments for that position. You guys can go read different people. I can provide you resources for this. But how we understand this as a church and want you to understand this is what Jesus is doing here in 36 is not beginning a new topic, but rather now He is beginning to He is beginning to discuss the day that He just talked about, and now how the disciples ought to act in their obedience as it comes in the future. Does that make sense? So Jesus is giving them all these signs. He's giving them the abomination of desolation. He's telling them what the final sign will be when you know the end has come. And now He's exhorting His disciples, how should they live in light of that, right? Because one way you could live is go crazy, right? If someone tells you, hey, the end of the world's about to happen. I mean, this happened, folks, this has happened 1,000,000 times in the past 2,000 years. How many different sects of Christianity or Christianity have started because some dude held up a Bible and said, the end is near. Everybody flee for your lives. And what do? People sell their livelihoods, their houses, everything, and then it doesn't happen. Folks, it has happened so many times, I could nauseate you with how many stories are recorded in church history of how many times that's happened. And so I think this text gets so abused when it comes to that because people will say it all the time. Well, you don't know the day and the hour. You don't know when it's going to come. But folks, listen. For the disciples, for them to hear that the temple is going to be destroyed, they needed a word from Jesus then on how you ought to live in light of that. Because what does the New Testament constantly say is happening in the day of the apostles? There are people, they're wanting their ears tickled and scratched. They have hearts that are set on genealogies and myths and on angels and on all these Old Testament principles, and they're not focused. They're living wild, they're living sexual. I mean, all this thing's going on. And He's trying to tell them, listen, as this end is drawing near of this age, here's how you ought to live. So I think in 36, the transition text is addressing that fundamental question. And so 36, concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Now, listen, Jesus has just given them a list of signs that they ought to expect to see, but won't be the sign that the end is happening. Then He gives them one sign to let them know. When you see this one, know that the end is very near. And then when that tribulation ends, there's going to be the coming of the Son of Man, and you will know that the end has happened, right? So that's the point. But now I think Jesus, the way He's addressing it with them is, He's not talking about a different day and hour than the one He had just previously talked about, but rather He's telling them the exact timing of it, you don't know. Right, brethren? Like you can look for the signs, just like the example of the fig tree. Right? That the tree grows up, the leaves blossom, but you don't know exactly when it's going to bud the fruit. You just know that the season's changing. You are keen enough to see. That's what He said is going to happen before this whole thing ends. We better be smart enough to see that and to go. And I think that's what He's addressing here with them. He's just telling them, hey, listen, I've given you all of this information about this so that you would be ready. Listen, it's going to happen in this generation, but the exact day and the hour, you don't know. And so what would the exhortation then be? Be watchful. Be ready. Be ready for that day. And what does being watchful and being ready mean in the New Testament? It doesn't mean pair of goggles looking up at the sky going, Jesus said, any minute. Don't bother me. Any minute He's coming. And you're just staring up into heaven. Being watchful means, how does your life look? How does Paul talk about it in Romans? Don't live like you live in the night. You live as if the day has shone. Right? And your deeds are being, displayed before everybody. Don't go living in debauchery like it's nighttime. Go live in the light. Go watch your life, how you live. Because those who lived contrary to what Jesus said would be those who get caught up in this judgment. So I know that's not a lot of explanation in that, and I know I kind of left the doozy last, and I'm already going a little bit over my time, so I don't want to go over anymore. So you guys can ask questions, but we're gonna wrap this one up. But so just to end that one off, I know that's a big fly through Matthew 24, but I do think that what you get continuing in Matthew 24 is the same point being established at the beginning in Matthew 24. And that transition text is simply discussing how the disciples ought to live now that they have been told all these things that are soon to come to pass in their own lifetime. So let's pray. You guys might have a lot of questions. We can talk and then get out of here. So.